Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Government Affairs Forum. What happened? What's next? Minnesota Politics 2020. Thanks for joining us today. As you can see on this slide, we have some housekeeping items. We'll remind you of these things throughout the conversation or chat function. If you experience technical issues, please follow the instructions. We'll try to help modify that for you. My name is Christine Levins. I'm the Vice President of the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce. This webinar, like in every other live event, could not occur without the support of our sponsors. So I'd like to thank CenterPoint Energy, Target, Wells Fargo, as well as our supporting sponsors today, Clearway Minnesota and the Minnesota Vikings. Please engage with us using Twitter today. You can see our handles at the bottom of the screen at Minneapolis Chamber and the hashtag Government Affairs. Today's panel is moderated by Brian McClung, who's partner and co-founder of MZA and Company. You can see his handle there. Our panelists are Brianna Biersbach and Brian Bass from the Star Tribune and NPR, respectively. We are going to be able to take questions today. We'll try to do the best we can to ask those in advance. So use the Q&A function to do that. With that, I'm going to invite our panelists to come online live and turn the conversation over to Brian McClung. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and participating today.
Hey, great. Thanks, Christine. And thanks to everybody for joining us for the session for the Minneapolis Regional Chamber Government Affairs Forum. It's been a wild 2020 in Minnesota politics, and we're only halfway through the year, much more to come. So with today's panel, we're going to talk about what happened during the regular legislative session, during the special session that happened earlier this month, during an expected special session that's coming up in July, and then as we look ahead into the fall, when all 201 seats in the Minnesota legislature are on the ballot, along with all 8 congressional offices, a U.S. Senate race, a lot of action here in Minnesota politics, and an exciting year, as we always have in Minnesota politics, where we have some of the strangest politics in the country. We're really excited to be joined by Brianna Biersbach and Brian Bax. I'll just give you a quick bios as we jump into the conversation. Brianna has spent the last decade covering Minnesota politics for various publications, including Minnesota Public Radio News and MinPost. She started her journalism career in college at the University of Minnesota, the fantastic newspaper there, the Minnesota Daily, where she covered City Hall. Brianna's also had the opportunity to work at the Pioneer Press, at the Associated Press, and at the Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal. And she teaches an awesome class at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs that I've had a chance to speak at. So Brianna, thanks for being a part of the conversation today.
Thanks,
and then Brian Bax. Brian is a political correspondent for Minnesota Public Radio News. Brian has more than 20 years of experience on the Minnesota political beat. He spent almost 17 years with the Associated Press, beginning during the exciting one term of Governor Jesse Ventura. Brian joined NPR in January 2016, has been covering politics there since. So Brian, thanks for being part of the conversation too.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
You bet. So kind of just want to do an overview and talk about the lay of the land this legislative year so far. As I've talked about it with folks, it's sort of a tale of 3 sessions, the way I think of it. The regular session kind of divided in 2. There was that first part of the legislative session from February 11th when we convened until March 13th, when Governor Walz issued that peacetime state of emergency, and COVID-19 really kind of overtook what was happening at the Capitol. And then that part of the legislative session from March 14th to May 18th when they adjourned the regular session. And then this roughly week-long special session here in mid-June. So talk to us about how different it is. It's hard to remember that far back, and it's hard to remember what happened yesterday, and we can't keep track of the days. But thinking back to the beginning of the session in February, and back then when there was a budget surplus and things were very different, tell us a little bit about how the session changed and how the cadence changed as we went through that initial part of the regular session, that second part of the regular session that was focused on COVID-19, and then the special session that we just had a week or so ago.
Well, it started off as a session where they didn't really have to do much of anything. And in fact, there was all the indications that they weren't going to do all that much this year. It's an election year. They have plenty of money. The budget was in decent shape, and they were going to come in late and get out in time to go start campaigning. I can't recall a year when there has been so many intervening events during the session. I mean, first of all, you've had the COVID-19 situation that shut down the legislature for a time, and then pushed them online just like everything else. And then when they did come back and didn't finish, and it appeared inevitable that they were going to come into special session, you had the George Floyd situation. I mean, the agenda changed so many times in the course of just a couple of months that it's really been very unpredictable. It will remain unpredictable. I mean, as you mentioned, they're probably going to come back in July, maybe in August, and who knows how many times after that until the election. Even in years where there have been major events, September 11th, the 35W bridge collapse, those things happened outside of session. So what response the legislature and state leaders had to do could be narrowly managed. This had to happen in the course of dealing with everything else that was on the table, and everything that they came in that they wanted to do pretty much took a back seat to these two major events.
Yeah, I think Brian summarized it really well. I mean, the only thing I would add is, the legislature is very plodding and slow typically, and that's how the beginning of session felt, right? We had this huge surplus, everybody had ideas how to use it, and they were holding hearings on what they were hoping to do with that. And then suddenly, as the coronavirus started to take hold in the state and obviously across the country and world, that suddenly changed. And suddenly a institution that, someone often describes it to me as knocks things around. They like to pass it and then pass it again and then pass it again until they get some kind of result that everybody can somewhat agree to. They didn't have that option anymore. They had to move incredibly quickly to spend hundreds of millions in state funding, which, that was before we even had this federal funding that's now been coming in to backfill it. But I've never seen so much money being spent so quickly in an institution that it usually moves incredibly slow and argues for months, and if they even get an agreement at the end of that long process. So it really forced them to adapt, to work quickly on some things, but also, as Brian mentioned, just to really narrow it down to exactly what they could agree to, which typically happens at the end of session, but it really had to happen on some major things early on in March, and then, so that was really striking to me, to watch the legislature have to ramp up what is a usually very slow process. And the focus has changed so many times. One thing that was really interesting at the end of the regular session, when they were trying to get an agreement on all of these things, both Senate Majority Leader Paul Zelka and Speaker Hortman said to me, we need to get as much of the stuff that we can agree to done now as possible, because we don't know what's going to happen before we come back for our special session. And of course, they had no idea of the movement that would occur following George Floyd's killing. So they didn't know what they meant when they said that, anything could happen. No one could have predicted that would happen, and again, changed the conversation completely again. So really put them in a bad position. They had a lot of things they wanted to get done, including the bonding bill that is now in limbo yet again.
Yeah, and Brianna, talk to us about covering the legislature in these circumstances. And you talked about how they had to change everything and work quickly, but they were doing a lot of that work remotely, and they were having Zoom committee hearings for the first time. A lot of technical issues with some of those as we watched when we were all logged in. Even difficult for legislators to follow which bills they were discussing and amendments to those bills sometimes and all of that. And presumably much less accessibility to legislators, to the governor, the lieutenant governor, members of the administration. So talk to us about some of the challenges and what it was like covering the legislature under these very different circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty striking. I mean, suddenly they were all in the building, all having public hearings, and then suddenly the building was mostly shut down and legislators had dispersed. And for that first return, they returned about a week after they first left for this month-long recess to do a few things. During there was almost no public input or ways to watch the process. They hadn't really started Zoom committee hearings yet. They were just talking offline behind closed doors about what they needed to do quickly. So the public had almost no input in kind of the first rounds of bills they passed in that recess, which was a huge problem. And a lot of people complained about it. And then they set up this process for Zoom hearings, which was totally new for everyone. I think, legislators' age tend to skew a little bit older. So I think for some signing into Zoom hearings using technology in this way was totally new. Everybody was very fascinated with what, backgrounds legislators were using and reading a lot into those things. But it improved over time, but there's always going to be difficulties. Legislators didn't know if they had their microphones muted, or you could hear things going on in the background. I don't know how many people's dogs and kids I've heard in the middle of committee hearings, just because that's what life has kind of been like during this pandemic. But access has still been really challenging. I am a reporter and I know about these hearings in advance. I'm a member of the public trying to testify in a narrow window on Zoom, whether or not you have technology. I just think it's been incredibly challenging. Lobbyists and groups that usually can walk into someone's office or grab them off, as they're heading into the floor, or pull them aside for a conversation can't do that. Reporters can't do that either. And that's been one of the most challenging things, I think, for myself and probably for Brian as well, is we're so used to being inside of the building, being able to grab people at any moment. If they're not calling us back, we can find them. We know exactly where to go to get them. Also, just to hear the buzz in the halls, what people are talking about, what might be sneaking up on us, some issue that we didn't expect. There was none of that. It made it really challenging to cover, and I think really challenging for the public to participate in. But it's obviously an unprecedented public health crisis. They've done some things that have helped, but I think in other ways it could be better.
Yeah, and Brian, a lot, like Brianna was saying, a lot of reporting is just bumping into people in the hallway, having those conversations, hearing, background, discussion about issues. Obviously, a lot of that is missing under these circumstances. So have you found yourself, do you spend more time on the phone with sources? How do you kind of make up for that lack of the regular human interaction that you have in reporting at the state capitol?
Absolutely. I mean, I haven't worn a tie since March. I've shaved maybe 4 or 5 times, including today, so you get that. But there have been numerous occasions where I've been texting all day and all night to try first of all, to get the pulse of what's really happening. And I want to jump on one point that Brianna made about access for the public. If you're just a member of the public who under normal circumstances could wander into a committee room and make your voice heard, that hasn't happened this year. But lobbyists, I think, have had maybe a different, have had to recalibrate as well. I know many lobbyists who have been able to have input in how these bills are shaped, through phone calls directly with the chairman or other people involved. And the way these bills have come together, they pretty much just appeared. There hasn't been, as you said, there hasn't been the normal give and take through amendments for the most part. Some committees have done that to a degree, but by and large, the product that you see emerge is the product that they're voting on, which for better or worse has really changed the process. The voting, I mean, just the process of voting by members has, Pat Murphy, the chief clerk of the House, was losing his voice toward the end of the session and the special session, because for every single vote, whether it be on amendments or the bill, he has to go through the names one by one. And a lot of people aren't in the building, not even in St. Paul. And in the Senate, there have been waves of senators that come in and vote at a time. So it has really slowed things down, but that's also, again, narrowed the agenda quite a bit. There's a lot of stuff that usually this time of year is just, flying in and up for consideration. That really didn't happen this year. There was a very slim agenda that got acted on toward April and May and again in June.
Yeah, and talk about that a little bit. There was that stretch of bipartisan cooperation that happened initially, and all 4 caucus leaders standing with the governor when he signed that initial amount of money for the Minnesota Department of Health to fight back against coronavirus. But then it seemed like after another month or so, politics started to come back in, and you had House Minority Leader Kurt Dowd first expressing concerns over the governor's use of his emergency powers, Senate Majority Leader Gazelka expressing some of those same concerns. So there was that time frame where there was a sense of the legislature and governor united and working together. But it started to slip over time, and maybe it's the differences in what legislators are hearing in their legislative districts versus, a governor managing the whole state. Talk to us about your sense of when that slippage started to occur, and how you sensed that.
Well, it's not unusual in a crisis for there to be harmony at the outset, because a lot of lawmakers really have trouble reading where the public is at. And in March and into early April, the public was really scared about what they didn't know about coronavirus, about whether it was going to be visited upon them or someone they know. And so there was a great deal of movement to at least start building protections against it and response capability, whether it be the hospitals or clinics or other entities. And as Brianna mentioned, they passed about $500 million worth of money out the door with very few specific destinations for it, which is unusual. I mean, that's money that normally they would probably know down to the penny as to where they want things to go. In this case, they put the money in the pot and said, we'll split it up later as we know what we need. But as the public started to get a little bit antsy with the stay-at-home orders and other restrictions they were facing, that's where you started to see things split. And by mid-April, when there were these protests, when the president was calling on states to liberate from the lockdown type things, that's where you really started to see the divide set in. And the last pretty much month and a half, 2 months have been fairly rigid divides in whether the Republicans who say that they should have more say and that there should be some loosening of greater loosening of the restrictions, and the Democrats who want to defer to the governor of their party. It's really left them kind of at odds.
Yeah, I wouldn't add much more to what Brian said. Republicans have said, we were all on board with this, these kind of emergency measures early on, but as the stay-at-home order came into effect and as it kind of stretched on, and particularly the choices within the orders, what could stay open, what could stay closed, or what was closed, I think contributed to the tensions. I mean, there was a lot of concern from Republicans about retail shops in their district. Why could the small mom and pop shop that sells clothes on Main Street why was that closed, but Target was open? So that contributed to it. The churches piece of it definitely caused some tensions. Also, one thing I never thought we would ever talk about, or could have never imagined we'd be tossing around as a political issue, is modeling. The modeling piece of this, the numbers that the state, the Department of Health, and in conjunction with the University of Minnesota were using to sort of predict what could happen. Obviously these numbers as were always, they were always couched as things that will change depending on orders that put in place in people's human behavior, which you can't always predict. But those numbers and what they said and how they were arrived at and the updates to those numbers became a political issue in a way in which I could have never imagined. And I think pretty greatly contributed to the tension among legislators as well.
Mm-hmm. And then when we got to the end of the regular legislative session, it really was kind of a bust. I mean, it was mostly anticlimactic, and the big piece of legislation that was looking to be advanced is the bonding bill, which of course requires a 60% vote to pass. So, the minority caucuses in both houses have a lot of say. What was your sense? It also didn't seem to have the usual pressure of the end of a legislative session. And I speculate, others speculate, maybe that was because legislators knew that the governor would extend his emergency powers in 30 days. And so they expected to come back for a special session around June 12th. But what was the mood at the end of the session as they were trying to wrap those things up compared with the mood at the end of a typical legislative session? And Brianna, you were talking about, what Speaker Hartman and others were saying to you at the end of that session. Maybe you could give us a sense of what they felt back on, May 18th.
Yeah, well, I was covering that session that weekend, the weekend of the end of session, and it did not, often it feels like hurry up and wait. There's some things happening behind closed doors, and then suddenly there's an agreement reached on one piece of the budget or the bonding bill, and suddenly there's a rush of activities. there was only the weight part of it. I felt, there was a lot of discussions going on behind closed doors. There was a lot of posturing going on both sides, passing things they wanted versus, sort of make their point, like, this is the bonding bill we want. This is the bonding bill we want. But there didn't feel like a sense of urgency or that rush part of a usual end of session. It felt like we were just sort of coasting toward this midnight deadline that they had to hit. And I do think you're right in that the fact that they knew they would be back, all but knew at that point that they would be back on June 12th and possibly, July 12th or 13th and possibly August 12th or August 13th, took the pressure off. They knew they had more time. Deadlines are important to legislators, important to a lot of people. Knowing that you have to finish something by this date puts pressure on you to find an agreement if you're going to find an agreement. I think that was just gone and not there at all in terms of part of the deal making this regular end of legislative session.
Well, and leaders always put a publicly brave face on things. We're this close on this and that, when in reality, everything is so tied together. And when it became clear that there was not going to be a grand bargain to get them done with everything, it was a matter of what else can they take into special session, because that becomes part of the strategy and negotiation points too. I mean, if you're talking about a bonding bill is something that in most years, the Democrats and their constituencies are most aggressive about wanting to be big, and Republicans, they do want many of these projects too, because they affect statewide districts around the state, but they also want to keep it as small as possible and just really hold to that fiscal discipline aspect. So they knew that the bonding bill was going to help them potentially later on. And as you noted, the House Minority Leader tied passage of the bonding bill to some pullback of the executive authority of the governor. And toward the end of the special session, the governor conceded that that was on the table, that he was negotiating kind of the scope, maybe not giving up the executive authority in whole, but allowing the legislature to step in some of these areas where he had tackled things by himself. And so things toward the end of the special session were moving, and you thought, well, there could be a chance that a few of these bigger items get done. But in terms of the regular session that had to end in May, when it was clear that they weren't going to get across the finish line, the air came out pretty quick.
Yeah, and tell us about that. You mentioned that Governor Walz had suggested that he was negotiating, or at least having conversations about his emergency powers. I don't know exactly what that means, because some of that, some of these are things that are in his executive orders and our powers that he has then under the state constitution. So it's not as if he can drop that necessarily. But tell us a little bit about what you think that conversation is like. I think that's an important conversation for potentially moving a bonding bill forward. Minority Leader Dowd and House Republicans have held pretty firm to the idea that they won't put votes up for a bonding bill until they see some movement on that. And that's, again, the biggest outstanding piece for 2020 for the legislature to accomplish. And do we think that under the current set of circumstances, as Brianna mentioned, do we think we're coming back roughly July 12th, roughly August 12th, roughly September 12th? I mean, if we come back August 12th, that's right after the August primary election. The primary is on August 11th. And then you really have politics in the midst of the special sessions occurring. So tell us a little bit about those kind of executive authority conversations, and whether or not, should we expect to have rolling special sessions every 30 days, or do we think they drop off at some point?
Well, I want you to think about this in a couple ways here. I mean, the broader executive power, the peacetime emergency he declared, is the triggering point to bring lawmakers back every 30 days. And that's basically saying that the situations warrant that I need to move quick and do a lot of other things. He has produced 60 or 70 additional orders that kind of piggyback on that order. And the piggybacking orders are what were probably under discussion, because the governor has said, once I pull back on the peacetime emergency, there are things that would immediately blink off, protections against evictions and different employment scenarios and things related to the unemployment insurance that to speed processes along. And so he basically says that the legislature would have to figure out an unwinding process, passing laws that allow for a slower ramp down so there's not this cliff. And I think that's what he's been asking the legislature to do. In terms of how long the peacetime emergency stays in place, I don't see it going away anytime soon, particularly as we're seeing around the country where the coronavirus is spiking again. I'm sure there's something in the back of the governor's mind thinking it might not be long before Minnesota starts trekking up that hill again. And do I want to leave myself without the ability to deploy the guard, to put other measures into place? Mm-hmm. I don't know if there's anything that would stop him from re-signing a new executive order once the peacetime emergency that has been in place is recedes. But I think he wants to leave himself the greatest amount of flexibility. So I would bet on him re-upping it in July at least. Whether he does it August and beyond, it depends on the circumstances on the ground.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember which. I was there on Friday night during the special session, and the governor had updated us a couple times, one at 2 a.m. and one much earlier. I'm trying to remember which press conference it was, but he did say that this was very much on the table, his emergency powers, and including a list of the things Brian just mentioned, all of the different orders that are tied underneath or tied to this emergency peacetime declaration, and which one of those might gone, which might blink off, which would stay in place. So I think that's really interesting. I don't know how far those negotiations ultimately got, but just the fact that they were having those conversations is really interesting because, as Brian mentioned, this is his whole ability to respond quickly to this crisis. And if he does end his emergency, his ability to react and do things quickly is severely limited without the legislature. One thing that has been thrown out to me is possibly negotiating peacetime emergencies for a future governor, the powers that a future governor or maybe not in the context of this pandemic, but in another future emergency could be changed. So not necessarily taking them away from him this time, but not taking them away, but changing the way in which they are given or stay with the governor. For example, right now under state law, the legislature can only reject an extension of emergency powers. They don't get the power to actually vote in favor of it continuing. So right now, because we have a divided legislature, they don't have both chambers being willing to reject his amendment or his emergency extension. So it just continues on. They want potentially more say in the future in actually approving it before it is extended. So that could be part of the conversation going forward.
I think we lost Brian.
Brian's frozen.
Gotcha. Oh, did I, there's can you guys hear me now? I see it clicking off a little bit. Here, I can pick it up on the phone. Can you hear me this way?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Well, when we're talking about that, I was curious to get your input on the next phase of Minnesota's reopening. And that's been an issue, the public is particularly interested in. The governor moved into phase 3 on June 10th. And now there's been discussion about opening up additional capacity. What's your sense from the Department of Health and from the governor's advisors about what they are looking for to consider moving Minnesota into a future phase? And what's the conversation with the legislature been about how those phases have gone?
Well, I mean, we're Friday of the week before the 4th, and a lot of people expected that the governor would have made an announcement this week to loosen additional regulations, where it would be additional restaurant capacity, potentially more entertainment venues allowed to open for summer activities. But the numbers in Minnesota have looked relatively good. I mean, the number of new cases is low compared to the number of tests being done. The number of hospitalizations and intensive care admissions has been declining or at least holding steady. So there was some thought, and the governor even suggested that he would go and take another turn of his dial sometime soon. But what's happening around the country is probably giving that room a little pause. There is tension within the different agencies. There are the agencies that deal with business and are more public facing, that hear a lot of concern and want to help those entities get back and running. And there's the public health agencies that see, the unpredictability of this virus and want to just take it slower. And so I don't think there's a clear consensus within the administration, but the fact that we haven't heard anything yet makes me think that nothing will be done prior to the 4th. I think they might be waiting to get beyond the 4th, because as we've seen around other places in the country, some of the Memorial Day gatherings could have been contributing factors to the renewed outbreaks in these places that moved faster than Minnesota to get back up to speed.
Yeah, I think Brian's exactly right. The only thing I would remind people is that the governor has also said at any point he can reel in some of these loosening of restrictions, turn the dial back forward. I'm not sure which, I guess back on restrictions if there is, for instance, a big outbreak or a sudden spike in cases all across the state. I think that people are in loosening mode and they're thinking about things opening up more, but with what's going on around the country and what could always happen at any point and what health officials have warned could come later in the year, some of these restrictions could very well come back and we could be again in a much more lockdown mode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is what we're seeing in Texas, where they're turning the dial back the other way now, right? So and I think that's a good issue or good concern for them. How hard would it be once you loosen things up? How much harder is it to bring it back? And what's the public reaction going to be when you get into a situation like that? Mm-hmm. One of the things we wanted to talk about was how news listeners and readers seem to have an opinion on just about everything that is reported these days. It's just very different than our sense of what reporting was like and everybody's ability to complain to you. I mean, we have your Twitter handles right here on the screen, so right, everybody has the ability to send you a note or tell you what they think about what you're reporting on, or whether or not they believe that you're expressing an opinion, all of those things. And so just wanted to get your thoughts about what it's like reporting in this environment. It's hard, like just from the president on down, you have people who are questioning media, and it seems to be, it's more difficult. It's nice that there's more access in some ways, and you probably hear from a broader array of sources and regular folks that you're reporting on than you would have otherwise. But it's balanced out with dealing with that kind of ongoing criticism, or people being downright aggressive and abusive at reporters who are out reporting on stories, as we saw in central Minnesota when the Care 11 reporter was up there reporting on the issues around that bar owner who was planning to reopen. So just curious to get your thoughts about the state of reporting now and what it's like with everybody weighing in on everything that's happening.
Well, I've been reporting, as long as I've been reporting, Twitter has been a thing. Actually, it was Brian who made me get my first Twitter account on my first day as an Associated Press reporter in 2010. So Twitter has always been in the background. I think as more people follow you, as you interact with more people, you certainly get, constant tweets. So sometimes, if it's some kind of big breaking news story or something that's really taken off for some reason, you really can't even possibly monitor all the tweets at you. And it kind of makes you a little bit, I feel like over the years, it's made me able to ignore, I think, a lot of stuff that isn't helpful, right? I think people will tweet at you, genuine questions about your story, genuine concerns about coverage, that I think about and sometimes interact with people if I think, here's why I did this, here's why I talked to this person. There's also a lot of it that's just, hostile and mean, and that you don't feed the trolls, right? I think that's a rule I almost always abide. sometimes it's, you feel like I really want to respond to this person, but generally you just don't have to. And it's not helpful most of the time. I would say being a political reporter, you're kind of, that's always been there, this feeling, that we're for one side or the other side, or we included this detail because we're a Republican or a Democrat. That's always been part of what we do. It's definitely increased over time. I've always advocated, journalists advocate for transparency in government. I think journalists should try to be more transparent about how we do our jobs. I think that the public rightfully doesn't understand a lot about how we get sources, why we include certain details. I get emails all the time on, why did you identify the governor as a Democrat? What does that have to do with who he is? It's part of our style. It's how we write our stories, but people don't understand that. People don't understand. I mean, there was a survey recently that showed a large majority of Americans still believe that journalists pay sources for stories. I think that there's a fundamental misunderstanding about how we do our jobs that is partially on us to clarify, and partially on us to try to in places where it's appropriate to say this is how we do our work, to try to show our homework a little bit more, so people can understand and maybe trust our process and trust us. But there's only so much you can do. I mean, we're in a polarized environment, not just toward reporters, but in every way. Another thing I like to check is my bubbles. I think, as you mentioned on Twitter, being on Twitter, you hear from more people than you ever have before, but at the same time, this is a curated group of people. I'm following, Capitol people. I'm following other journalists. I'm following people who I'm more likely to interact or need to get information from. And in a sense, that is a bubble of my own creation, and you have to look outside of it. You have to remember that this is only a small subset of the public that you've created and curated for yourself. It's not representative of the state of Minnesota or the country as a whole, and we always need to check that bubble, check the things we're hearing, who we're hearing from, and step out and collect more voices. And I think by always checking those things, always trying to find people who we're not talking to, who have valuable perspectives, it helps people feel more trust in us and might appreciate us a little bit more than they do.
I'll confess,
Brian, you were there pre-Twitter, so yeah. you can give us the pre-Twitter. Although imagine if Jesse Ventura had Twitter, what that would have been like.
Well, he does now, but yeah, during his time. And no, I'll confess I have it open on my desktop all day long and check it probably far too often. And I do enjoy hearing from people, because sometimes they have information that I didn't know about, or a perspective that is worth exploring. But I also try to, as Brianna said, keep in mind that it's the people who use these social media platforms is a fraction of people who consume news in other ways. My first responsibility as a Minnesota Public Radio news journalist is to serve the NPR News audience through the radio and through its website. So I always try to make sure I'm pulling back. I'm not too narrow focused on just what is happening, what the discussion is online, what's happening, why does it matter, how might it affect people's lives, and try to just keep those things in mind as I report for the broader audience. I don't feel like the Twitter audience is always the greatest barometer of public sentiment or what's important out there. So it's just keeping things calibrated in your mind is important. And as you mentioned, my first several years there was no such thing as Twitter or this engagement tool. And so people relied on us much more to be the eyes and ears on the ground. Now they can see everything for themselves and comment in real time, and that's great. They should be able to voice their opinion. Sometimes they probably do so in a much more gentle way. I think sometimes the even within the Capitol ecosystem, things have become much more toxic, and when you didn't have staff members taking on elected officials in such a public way, and I think that has probably changed a lot of the dynamic. People wonder sometimes why there's so much acrimony and gridlock up there, and it's people are at each other all the time, whether it's in person or online, and I think it has had a downside effect on just the kind of the mood up there. But
I'll add one thing. I think that there's a lot of feelings about journalists and, either animosity coming from both sides. But I do think in this moment, I've never felt more essential to regular people. I remember after the governor's stay-at-home order was put in place, the first iteration of it, kind of the most extreme version of shutting things down to stop and slow the spread of the virus. I wrote a story about it for the paper and online, and then I wrote an explainer on it on the same day, and my phone number was at the bottom of both of those stories. And the next morning, my phone would not stop ringing. I had my headset in, and I would get done with one call, and then my phone would ring 2 seconds later, and every single one was someone asking me, well, what do I do about my daughter's wedding that's in a month? Or, is my husband an essential employee? Can he go to work? Because we really need him to be able to go to work. One woman called me and said that she drives she's older and her husband is elderly and has a hard time walking, and she would drive him every night to the lake and sit in the car and look at the lake. And she didn't know if she could do that. She just wanted to know if she could still do that with her husband. So I think there's a lot of feelings about journalists right now, but I also think that people really need the information that we're providing in really hard circumstances. And I've my inbox has been flooded, and my phone lines have been flooded on a lot of these stories. And I felt like I've really been helping people understand this challenging time.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. So we mentioned we're taking questions through the Q&A section here on the video screen. So for those of you, go down and click. We've got a couple that have come in, so we want to get to those. The first one that's come in is, do you think when the legislature comes back in a special session that there might be action to support the rebuilding of Lake Street, West Broadway, and other areas in the Twin Cities that have been impacted by civil unrest?
I think there will be in some form. I mean, obviously, there's a bill that passed in the House that would devote hundreds of millions of dollars toward that effort. And I don't think it will be as big as that in the end. But even in the Senate, they're talking about including measures perhaps in the bonding bill to do appropriation bonds to help set up either through nonprofits or through various public infrastructure programs to help get those areas back up and running, because I don't think anybody at the legislature wants to leave a kind of a hole in that part of the city. A lot of immigrant-owned businesses were impacted, and they feel like they want to make sure that those entrepreneurs get the chance to have a reboot. And so there is a lot of conversation around that. It's part of the mix, and I would expect that it will be part of a deal, bigger deal at some point this summer.
Yeah, I would echo that. Both sides seem to want to do that when I talked to them about it during the special session. And I think that, like as Brian said, it could be in a bonding bill, it could be the separate package that has been discussed. I don't know if we know what form that'll take, but I would at some point something will happen for businesses. I think it was a Republican Senator, Eric Pratt, who said, like we've said, the state can't run without certain economies in greater Minnesota. It can't run without the economic engine of Minneapolis and St. Paul too. So they recognize that they want to make sure those businesses can get up and running.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Senator Senjum right away had talked about a bonding bill and a separate bill for Minneapolis and St. Paul to help out with some of this. So yeah, that's been part of the conversation. There's a lot of work going on with the Minneapolis Regional Chamber and the Lake Street Council and West Broadway Coalition and others to make that case and help support that. So that I think we'll hear about that a lot over the next few weeks here. One other specific question on the legislative session and what we might see on the horizon, and that is, what do you all feel is the likely outcome for finding middle ground and passing an environment finance bill during the special session that would include Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, LCCMR projects? And that's been a hold up to do those the legacy projects. Curious to hear your thoughts on if they might be able to figure out a way to solve the hang up they've had.
Well, it's unusual that it didn't get done during the session. That would normally be one of the items that they would have gotten done. I must confess, I am not on top of that one, so it would be wrong for me to wager a guess, and I'll look into it and see what I can find out. If you want to pass along the commenters information, I can try to answer that offline.
Yeah, same. There's been so many things to track. It's hard to keep on top of every single one, but it usually is passed during regular session without a whole lot of fanfare, or at least, disagreement. So it's unusual, but it hasn't really been something that I'm hearing directly about from the leaders. It might be more rank and file members who are working out the deals on that and then bringing it up to leadership.
Gotcha. One other question that came up, and we were talking about this offline as well. Brian, you reported this morning you have a story on the Lieutenant Governor Flanagan chairing the Capitol Architecture Board, and then beginning the discussion of the issues around the Christopher Columbus statue being pulled down by protesters, an overall process for kind of looking at more holistically artwork around the state capitol, and how to consider, what type of image are we portraying of the state, and does it reflect ourselves and all of our communities? And then also within that, talking about Senator Gazelka establishing an oversight committee to look into the actions during the civil unrest after the police killing of George Floyd. And so wanted to talk a little bit about that coming together, and also the issue of the Minneapolis City Council, several members of the council talking about defunding the police or potentially having a charter amendment on the ballot this fall. They're hoping to move forward with a vote at the Minneapolis City Council today. Just kind of talk to us a little bit about what you heard as you were reporting on, Senator Gazelka's new committee, the Capitol Architecture Board, and then thinking about the politics around defunding the police and what the Minneapolis City Council are discussing.
Well, specifically as it relates to what on the Capitol grounds, the monuments and so forth, this has always been a conversation about addition, and we've never really had the conversation about subtraction, about what things will stand the test of time, what things might be viewed in a different context now. And so what this board is planning to do is set up a formal process where people can petition to have various items discussed and potentially reevaluated for removal. That will probably take a few months to sort itself out. Beginning next week, as you mentioned, the Senate is holding oversight hearings into the decision-making around the civil unrest, and what resources were deployed, what resources weren't deployed, how soon, and kind of what tactics were used to quell the disturbances. And I think that will feed into kind of the political strategy that Republicans see at least some room to maneuver in. They think that people might have been comfortable expressing dissent around police tactics and police brutality, but they weren't as comfortable with businesses being taken out, burned down, looted. And I think that there are there's some thought that there's people in the surrounding suburbs that will be less comfortable going into the Twin Cities if there is less of a police presence, or a different kind of police presence. So I think right now you could see the political angling take shape, and it's building to some degree off of what the president has tweeted incessantly, law and order. I think he's tweeted that about 30 times in the last few weeks. And I think there must be some polling out there that shows that those words together strike a chord. Of course, there's a lot of unpredictability around that. I mean, I live in a suburb, and I see George Floyd signs in yards. I see George Floyd T-shirts around. You might not expect that, and it's so things might be harder to pigeonhole than some political leaders think.
And Brianna, we mentioned you covered City Hall back in we were reporting with the Minnesota Daily, so you're our City Hall expert. What are your thoughts about Minneapolis City Hall? And I think they're trying to move very quickly to get this forward, maybe faster than the Charter Commission or others will be able to do, considering that it's almost July, and they have to get the ballots together soon. But what's your sense of the politics and the give and take in Minneapolis on this issue about how reform police or defund, abolish police, and the tension going on there?
Well, I think one of the challenges right away was sort of this defund, dismantle language was out there, but I think immediately there wasn't a clear idea among the public or communicated to the public what that meant. As far as I understand the conversations, dismantling is not the same as abolishing, and defunding is not the same as abolishing. It's sort of moving resources around, thinking about community policing more. It's not getting rid of the police, and so the conversation has really become abolish versus dismantling and defunding, which is different. And I think it's interesting how it's played into the legislature. The legislature does not have a bill or did not discuss or entertain a bill to dismantle Minneapolis police or abolish police or any police force. That was not part of the conversation. But Senate Republicans did sort of make clear that they would not entertain that idea, and Democrats pushed back, saying, we never actually introduced that idea. But it's been fascinating to see how this idea from one city council and one state is really going across the country. I mean, it's really becoming part of the conversation for politicians running for re-election. For Joe Biden, he had to, a day after this was announced, had to sort of state his position on it, which is not in favor of abolishing. And I think that we're going to keep hearing more from candidates about where they stand on this as it is part of the conversation. So it's really become a political issue, not just for the council, but for every Democrat or every politician potentially across the country this election cycle.
Great. Well, we'll almost wrap it up here, but I just want to ask a lightning round question, feeding off Brianna. You mentioned Joe Biden taking a position on police reform, and that coming out of the conversation here in Minnesota. Minnesota is a battleground state again in the presidential campaign. We haven't always been over the last several cycles, but we certainly are now. We're seeing a lot of action from both sides in the presidential campaign. What should we look for and expect? I think we have a handful of congressional races that are at the top of the national list. We have, we're in play in the presidential election, I think. What should we look for and think about as Minnesota has that battleground state status once again in 2020?
Well, one thing I'm going to be watching for, I mean, obviously this campaign in a pandemic is going to look totally different. I think that's going to mean a lot more digital, a lot more television advertising, a lot more signs outside that people can look at, and potentially a lot more misinformation and possibly disinformation coming out from national groups, potentially even candidates themselves. So in this sort of situation where people are a little bit more stuck to their couch or not necessarily hearing from candidates directly themselves, what kind of information might be flying out that isn't accurate for voters? I think that we have potentially a ripe situation for that this cycle.
Yeah, I mean,
Minnesota.
We're in parade season, and there's not going to be many parades, and so it just underscores how candidates and campaigns are going to have to find new ways to engage voters. This would normally be the time that they would happen upon people, and instead they're having a lot more digital things. But those don't kind of reach the general audience that maybe they're looking for. I'll be watching to see how long Minnesota is realistically in play. I mean, if there are other states around the country that creep onto the map, can the presidential campaigns afford to fight over Minnesota, or does the Trump campaign move on knowing Minnesota's past? And the same goes for the congressional races. I mean, how much does the triage, how soon does the triage happen? There are probably 3 or 4 on the map now. Last cycle there were 4 to 5 that were in play. It'll be interesting to see how long that those remain top tier or one side or the other pulls out.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, Brian and Brianna, for the conversation. We really appreciate it. It's great insights. 2020 is certainly a year that none of us expected or anticipated, and lots to come in the political world. So we ask everybody, remember, subscribe to the Star Tribune. be a member for Minnesota Public Radio, support local journalism, and support the Chamber of Commerce. So thank you all. With that, I'll turn it over to Vice President Christine Levins for the wrap-up comments.
Thank all of you. This would normally be the point in a live event that we would be doing some sort of applause. So consider that done. Again, yes, we thank you both. I'll be watching both of your Twitter feeds as you play through the next month and the next session. I know, Brianna, I wasn't sleeping on the Friday night into the Saturday morning of the session. So I saw you at your activity at 3:30 in the morning. I hope not to actually do that again. Again, we need to thank our sponsors today, CenterPoint Energy, Target, Wells Fargo, Clearway, Minnesota, and the Minnesota Vikings. We hope you found this program interesting. We will have it on YouTube, I think probably by the end of the day or tomorrow. We do have several events coming up. There's going to be a slide here. We'll send this information to you as well. I want to call your attention to the Critical Issues Forum. In the conversation, we referenced potential changes to some of their eviction restrictions and that sort of thing. So we're going to have a robust conversation about the future of housing, what that looks like for affordability during COVID-19 and through an equity, health, and safety lens. So I encourage you to attend that as well. With that, we'll say goodbye. Everyone enjoy your Friday. Hopefully the skies will clear and we'll get outside. And again, thanks to our speakers and to Brian McClung.